My name is Evelyn, and I am 30 years old. 18 months ago, my mother called my boss at the marketing firm in Missoula and told him I was a drug addict, stealing trade secrets to fund a cult. She sent a 10-page letter to my husband's mother, claiming I was a pathological liar who only married her son for a modest inheritance. She weaponized every secret I ever shared with her, turning my world into a minefield of suspicion and shame, until I had no choice but to vanish. I changed my number, moved 3 towns over, and built a wall of silence that I thought was impenetrable. Then, this morning, a white SUV pulled into my gravel driveway in the Montana highlands. I watched through the digital lens of my porch camera as the two people who tried to dismantle my life stepped out looking like the picture-perfect grieving parents. My mother was holding a Pyrex dish wrapped in a checkered towel, and my father was adjusting his cap, checking his watch with the same cold impatience he used when I was a child. They found me, and they expect me to open the door. Before we dive into the wreckage of what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. If this narrative of survival resonates with you, also drop your age in the comments below. I am curious to see who else has had to build a fortress to keep their own blood at bay. The vibration of the first knock traveled through the floorboards and settled in my teeth. It was a rhythmic, demanding sound, 3 sharp raps, a pause, and then a heavy thud of a fist. It was the signature knock of Diane, a woman who treated politeness as a tactical weapon. Beside her stood Gerald, his hands shoved deep into his denim jacket pockets. They looked around my property with a possessive, squinted gaze, evaluating the timber of my porch and the quality of my siding as if they still had a right to appraisal. I stood in the dim light of the entryway, my hand inches from the deadbolt, but I didn't move. My heart wasn't racing with the frantic pulse of a victim anymore. Instead, it was a slow, heavy thrum of disbelief. She leaned toward the wood of the door, her voice muffled but distinct. "Evelyn, honey, we know you are in there. We saw the car. It is freezing out here, and we have been driving for 3 hours. We just want to talk. I brought your favorite chicken divan." I looked at the screen of my phone, zooming in on her face. She was performing for the empty street, her eyes glistening with rehearsed tears, her posture slumped to suggest a mother broken by a daughter's cruelty. The irony was a physical weight in the air. I had been allergic to mushrooms since I was 12 years old, a fact she ignored at every Sunday dinner for 2 decades because she preferred the texture of cream of mushroom soup over my ability to breathe. That casserole sitting on my welcome mat was not an olive branch. It was a test of my submission. Behind me, the floor groaned. Caleb stood at the end of the hallway, his face a mask of weary protection. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask if I was going to let them in. He simply watched me, his hand resting on the doorframe, ready to support whatever version of myself I chose to be in this moment. We had spent $5,000 on trauma therapy over the last year and a half, unlearning the reflexive guilt that Diane had spent my entire upbringing installing in my spine. Looking at the camera feed, I realized the woman on my porch wasn't a mother. She was a debt collector coming to claim a life she felt she owned. I stood there in the absolute silence of my home, watching the seconds tick by on the digital display. I watched for 1 minute, then 2, then 5. It was the most peaceful 11 minutes of my life, watching them realize that their power stopped at the threshold of my home. But as Gerald began to pace the length of the porch, and his face turned a familiar mottled shade of purple, I knew the quiet wasn't going to last. The first layer of their facade was about to crack, and the real reason for their cross-state journey was about to claw its way to the surface. As I stand here watching the digital screen, the sight of Diane's face triggers a visceral memory of the day the ground beneath my feet finally gave way. This wasn't some slow drifting apart or a series of polite disagreements over holiday plans. The silence I am maintaining today was earned in the fluorescent-lit trenches of a corporate office in Missoula 18 months ago. At the time, I was a senior marketing analyst for a top-tier firm, a position I had bled for. I was 36 months into a 5-year plan that had me sitting in a vice president's leather chair before my 30th birthday. I was the golden girl of the department, the one who pulled 60-hour weeks and delivered data-driven miracles. Then came Tuesday morning. I remember the way the air in the office felt brittle as I walked toward the conference room. My boss, Marcus, was a man who prided himself on his stoic professional detachment, but that morning he couldn't even meet my gaze. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, I could see a woman I didn't recognize sitting at the mahogany table. She was from corporate relations, flown in from the regional headquarters, with a folder thick enough to bury a career. Marcus finally looked up, his expression one of profound discomfort and a flicker of pity that made my stomach turn. He told me to sit down, and then he played a recording from the company's ethics and safety hotline. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. It was the same sugary, trembling tone Diane was currently using on my porch. On the recording, she claimed she was calling out of desperate motherly concern. She told the operator that I had suffered a total mental breakdown, that I was being held captive by a dangerous man named Caleb who belonged to an extremist fringe group. She didn't stop there. To ensure the company took action, she fabricated a narrative that I was actively harvesting proprietary client data to fund a planned disappearance. She used the word cult 5 times in 3 minutes. She described me as unstable, paranoid, and a liability to the firm's multi-million-dollar contracts. For 4 agonizing hours, I sat in that glass cage. I had to provide bank statements to prove I wasn't funneling money to a fictitious organization. I had to pull up photos of Caleb, a soft-spoken architect, to prove he wasn't a radicalized leader. I had to undergo a psychological evaluation with a corporate-appointed therapist, while my coworkers watched through the glass, whispering about why the police weren't involved yet. Every time a notification chimed on my phone, it was another voicemail from her. 17 messages in total. In the first few, she was sobbing, begging me to come home to the ranch so she could save my soul. By the 10th message, her voice had dropped an octave, turning cold and predatory. She told me that if I didn't quit my job and leave Caleb by sunset, she would call the local news. She said she would rather see me in a psychiatric ward than in the arms of a man she couldn't control. Marcus eventually cleared me of any wrongdoing, but the damage was systemic. You can't unhear a mother calling her daughter a thief and a lunatic. The promotion I had been promised vanished into thin air, replaced by a polite suggestion that I take some time off to handle my family matters. As I walked out of that building, my professional reputation was a smoldering ruin. Diane thought this would break me. She expected me to drive straight to her house, fall on my knees, and beg for her forgiveness and her roof. She truly believed that by destroying my independence, she would force my return. Instead of turning toward the ranch, I drove to a law office downtown. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat in a waiting room and watched the sunset over the mountains, feeling a strange, icy clarity take hold. I realized that Diane didn't love me. She loved the version of me that functioned as an extension of her own ego. When I chose Caleb, a man who saw through her manipulation, I became a defect that needed to be corrected. That afternoon, the bridge wasn't just burned, it was nuked from orbit. I handed a retainer to a lawyer and gave him a list of every relative, every friend, and every professional contact Diane had ever touched. But as I left that office, a new, sharper conflict began to take shape. I realized that Diane wasn't just going after my job. She was a woman who understood the power of a narrative, and she had already moved on to her next target. Even as I was signing the paperwork to sever our ties, my phone buzzed with an alert from a social media account I hadn't checked in weeks. She had started reaching out to Caleb's mother, Beatrice. My mother wasn't satisfied with ruining my career. She was now moving to poison the only safe harbor I had left. The realization that she was currently writing letters to my future mother-in-law sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my veins. It was no longer about a job or a house. It was a war for the very people I loved, and I was already 3 steps behind her opening move. I look back at the screen now, seeing Gerald bang his fist against the door again. He thinks this is about a daughter being stubborn. He has no idea that I still have the transcripts of those HR calls saved in a cloud drive, a digital reminder of why this door will never ever open. I watched Diane pull a tissue from her sleeve and dab at her eyes, knowing that behind those tears is the same woman who tried to have me committed for the crime of wanting a life of my own. The silence in my hallway feels like a shield, but as the minutes pass, I see Gerald reaching for his cell phone. He isn't calling me. He is dialing someone else, and the look of smug triumph on his face tells me that the porch visit is only the distraction for a much larger, much more public ambush they have planned for the neighborhood. They aren't here for a reunion. They are here to stage a scene that will make it impossible for me to stay in this town. The escalation is happening in real time, and I can see the shadows of my neighbors moving behind their curtains, drawn to the spectacle my parents are creating on my front step. This is exactly how she ruined me in Missoula, and now she is bringing that same scorched earth policy to my new doorstep in the highlands. I can feel the peace of the last 11 minutes evaporating, replaced by the cold necessity of a counterattack I never wanted to launch. I glance at Caleb, and I see him looking at his own phone. His face has gone pale. My mother didn't just stop at HR or his mother. She found something else, a secret from my past I thought I had buried under a different name, and she's currently broadcasting it to every contact on my new professional network. The nightmare isn't over. It's just found a new way to scream. The memory of the glass-walled office in Missoula still pulses in my mind like a fresh bruise, but the workplace sabotage was merely the opening salvo in my mother's campaign to dismantle my existence. As I look through the peephole at Diane adjusting her floral scarf on my porch, I am reminded of her most surgical strike. It happened while I was still picking up the pieces of my career, trying to convince myself that my personal life was at least a safe harbor. Diane knew better. She understood that to truly break me, she had to poison the well of my future family. She went for the jugular by targeting Beatrice, Caleb's mother. Beatrice is a retired middle school teacher living in a quiet, cedar-shingled house in Seattle. She is a woman who values integrity and the quiet dignity of a life well lived. To Diane, those virtues were nothing more than vulnerabilities to be exploited. One rainy Tuesday, Beatrice received a thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a 10-page handwritten manifesto that would have made a Victorian novelist blush with its dramatic intensity. Diane had spent days crafting a masterpiece of character assassination, painting a portrait of me that I didn't recognize. She wrote with the practiced grace of a concerned parent, claiming that her heart was shattered because she had to warn another mother about the monster I had become. The letter described me as having a history of clinical deception, a phrase she used to make my childhood rebellions sound like a psychiatric diagnosis. She told Beatrice that I had a pattern of discarding people once I had milked them for their resources, and that Caleb was simply my next victim. The most chilling part of the letter wasn't the prose, it was the attachments. Diane had included what she called medical evidence to support her claims. They were actually forged notes from a brief period in high school when she had forced me to see a local therapist because I had dared to apply to out-of-state colleges without her permission. She had taken those 20-year-old scribbles about adolescent anxiety and doctored them to look like a contemporary evaluation of a sociopath. She whispered through the ink that I was only marrying Caleb to get my hands on his modest inheritance, a small fund his grandfather had left him for a house down payment. She warned Beatrice that once the papers were signed, I would isolate Caleb from his family and bleed him dry before vanishing again. I remember the day Beatrice called me. Her voice, usually warm and steady, was trembling with a mixture of confusion and horror. She didn't accuse me right away, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I had to sit in my cramped apartment, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned white, explaining that my own mother was a woman capable of forging medical records to ruin a wedding. It was a humiliating conversation. To defend myself, I had to expose the rotting floorboards of my upbringing to a woman I had only known for a year. I had to admit that the woman who gave birth to me was my primary antagonist. It was a level of vulnerability that felt like being flayed alive. Beatrice eventually stood by us, but the damage to our relationship was subtle and permanent. Every time she looked at me for the next 6 months, I could see her searching my face for the history of clinical deception Diane had promised was there. The wedding planning, which should have been a time of joy, became a tactical exercise in damage control. Diane didn't want to attend the wedding. She wanted to ensure it never happened. She wanted to make the world so small, so hostile, and so devoid of support that I would have no choice but to crawl back to the ranch in Montana. She wanted me to be the quiet, obedient girl who didn't have a voice or a husband or a career. She wanted a doll she could pose on her furniture, not a daughter who lived 3 towns away. Watching her now on the camera feed, I can see that same calculated intent in the way she holds that Pyrex dish. She thinks that 18 months of silence has softened the blow of her betrayal. She thinks I have forgotten the nights I spent crying on the kitchen floor because I thought my future mother-in-law hated me. But as I observe her, I notice my father Gerald checking his phone again. He looks annoyed not at his wife's behavior but at the lack of immediate results. He stares at the dark windows of my house, and I see him lean over to whisper something in Diane's ear. Her expression shifts instantly from the grieving mother to something sharper, more predatory. The conflict is shifting again. I realize that the letter to Beatrice was just one thread in a much larger web. While they stand on my porch, playing the role of the shunned parents, I see a notification pop up on my own tablet, which is synced to my old email address. It is an alert from a community Facebook group for our new town. Someone has just posted a photo of my house with a caption about a welfare check for a woman being held against her will. My parents aren't just here for a chat. They are actively calling for a public intervention. They are trying to recreate the Missoula HR incident on my front lawn, using the neighbors as their new audience. I feel a surge of heat in my chest as I realize Diane has already started the next phase of her siege. She isn't waiting for me to open the door anymore. She is counting on the fact that in a small Montana community, people can't mind their own business when a mother is sobbing on a porch. The letter to Beatrice failed to break my engagement, so now she is going after my sanctuary. She wants to make me a pariah in my own neighborhood. I look at Caleb, who is now standing by the window, peering through a sliver in the blinds. His jaw is set tight. He sees the police cruiser rounding the corner of our street. Diane didn't just bring a casserole, she brought the authorities. She has escalated this from a family dispute to a legal confrontation, and she is standing there with a smile hidden behind her tissue, waiting for the flashing lights to force my hand. The peace of my morning is dead buried under the weight of a 10-page lie that has finally traveled from Seattle to my own front gate. The trap is sprung, and I am forced to decide if I will stay hidden or step out into the storm she has spent nearly 2 years perfecting. The failure to dismantle my relationship with Beatrice didn't cause Diane to retreat. Instead, it pushed her into the digital arena, where she could play the role of the martyr to a global audience. By the 3rd month of my total silence, the private war shifted into a very public social media siege. I had disconnected my phone and deleted my primary profiles, but you can never truly scrub your existence from the minds of people who think they own your story. My mother didn't file an official police report because she knew the authorities would find me healthy, sane, and wanting nothing to do with her. She didn't want the truth. She wanted a narrative. It started with a single post on a local Montana community page. It was a grainy photo of me at age 5 wearing a yellow sundress and holding a dandelion, my face smeared with the innocent joy she had spent the subsequent 25 years methodically erasing. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. It read, "Pray for our lost sheep. We don't care what you have done, Evelyn. We don't care about the mistakes or the people who have led you astray. We just want our daughter back. Just come home. There are no questions asked, only open arms." She didn't specify what those mistakes were, leaving a cavernous space for the internet to fill with the darkest imaginings. To the casual observer, I wasn't a woman seeking autonomy. I was a wayward child who had fallen into some nebulous abyss of sin or crime. The post went viral within our social circle. Within 48 hours, it had hundreds of shares. Diane began posting daily countdowns. Day 92 without my baby girl. Day 93. Still waiting by the porch light. She curated an online museum of my childhood, posting photos of my high school graduation, my first car, and family camping trips, where I was smiling because I hadn't yet learned that her love came with a hidden ledger of debts. She never mentioned the HR calls. She never mentioned the forged medical records. She presented herself as a saint in a floral blouse, a woman whose only sin was loving too much. Then came the messages. My secondary inbox, the one I used for old school contacts and distant relatives, began to groan under the weight of the collective outrage. My high school chemistry teacher, a man I hadn't spoken to in a decade, sent a 3-paragraph lecture about the sanctity of the fifth commandment. My cousin Brenda, who hadn't checked on me once during my actual bouts with depression, called me a heartless ice queen. She told me that Diane was losing weight and couldn't sleep because of my cruelty. One by one, the people who had known me for years fell in line behind the digital bonfire Diane had lit. They didn't see the gaslighting or the decades of psychological control. They saw a grieving mother and a daughter who had apparently abandoned her blood for a man. The narrative was set in stone. In the eyes of my hometown, I was the villain. I was the girl who turned her back on the ranch and the parents who sacrificed everything for her. Every time I tried to block one account, 3 more would surface. Total strangers began commenting on my old professional headshots, telling me I should be ashamed of myself. It was a digital stoning orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Diane knew that I valued my privacy and my integrity above all else, so she went after them with a scorched earth policy. She wanted to make my name so toxic that I would feel I had no choice but to return to the only people who would still take me in. Caleb watched me spiral during those weeks. He saw me staring at the screen, my hands shaking as I read messages from people who knew nothing of the reality behind the photos. He tried to take my phone away, but the curiosity was a form of self-torture. I wanted to see how far she would go. I wanted to see if there was a single person who would stop and ask, why did she leave? Why would a successful woman walk away from everything unless the house was on fire? But no one asked. In the court of social media, the first person to cry is usually the one who wins the verdict. The pressure began to leak into my new life. Even in a different town, the digital trail followed me. I would see people at the local grocery store look at me with a flicker of recognition, their eyes narrowing as they tried to remember where they had seen my face. It was the missing girl, the one who broke her mother's heart. The air in my new sanctuary started to feel thin, as if the walls of the house were closing in. I was no longer Evelyn, the marketing professional. I was a fugitive from a family that refused to let me go. Watching Diane now through the peephole, I see her hold up her own smartphone. She's filming. She is recording the closed door, narrating her heartbreak in real time for whatever live stream audience she has cultivated. I can almost hear the comments scrolling by on her screen. Break the door down, call the cops. She's so ungrateful. My father stands behind her, looking at the street as if expecting an army to arrive and back them up. They aren't here for a private reconciliation. They are here to provide the season finale for the drama they've been broadcasting for months. I realized then that the social media siege wasn't just about shaming me. It was about creating a justification for what they are doing right now. By painting me as unstable and lost for 18 months, they have laid the groundwork for a forced intervention. If the neighbors see the police arrive, they won't see a daughter being harassed. They will see a rescue mission. Diane has successfully weaponized the sympathy of strangers to turn my own front porch into a stage for my public execution. But as I watch her adjust the camera angle to capture the perfect tear rolling down her cheek, I notice something she doesn't see. A car has pulled up behind their SUV. It isn't a neighbor, and it isn't the police cruiser I saw earlier. It's a black sedan with tinted windows, and the man who steps out is carrying a leather briefcase. He doesn't look like a friend, and he certainly doesn't look like an adoring fan from her Facebook page. Gerald's posture changes instantly. The smugness vanishes, replaced by a sharp, jagged anxiety. He tries to block Diane's view, but it's too late. The man in the suit is walking toward them, ignoring the casserole on the mat and the phone in Diane's hand. I feel a cold spark of curiosity. The social media campaign was designed to isolate me, but it seems Diane's public posts have attracted a kind of attention she didn't bargain for. She wanted the world to look at us, and now the world is looking. But they are looking at the legal cracks she tried to hide behind her toddler photos. The conflict is no longer just between a mother and a daughter. A third party has entered the fray, and by the way my father is fumbling with his car keys, I suspect the social media siege has just backfired in the most spectacular way possible. I move closer to the door not to open it, but to hear the exact moment their digital kingdom starts to crumble under the weight of their own publicity. The drama hasn't just increased, it has shifted into a legal territory that Diane can't navigate with a floral blouse and a fake sob. The digital screen on the wall continues to glow, but I move my face toward the actual door, pressing my forehead against the cold timber to look through the physical peephole. This tiny circle of glass distorts the world outside, turning my parents into warped fisheye versions of themselves. Diane is leaning in so close that I can see the fine lines of theatrical grief etched around her mouth. She is speaking directly to the wood now, her voice pitched in that high melodic frequency she uses when she wants the neighbors to hear her maternal devotion. "Evelyn, honey, please. It is getting so cold out here. We just want to talk for 5 minutes. We drove all this way because we missed you so much. We even brought your favorite, that chicken divan you always loved at the ranch." The sound of that dish's name sends a bitter shiver through me. The irony is a sharp blade. I have been violently allergic to mushrooms since I was 12 years old. I remember the hives, the gasping for air, and the emergency room visits that punctuated my adolescence. Yet every single Sunday dinner for 2 decades, Diane placed that exact casserole in the center of the table. She ignored my medical reality because she liked the creamy texture of the sauce, and she viewed my allergy as a personal affront to her cooking. To her, my inability to eat her signature meal was a form of teenage rebellion she needed to break. Seeing that Pyrex dish sitting on my welcome mat today isn't a gesture of love. It is a flag of conquest. It is her way of saying that even after 18 months, she refuses to acknowledge the basic facts of my physical existence. She isn't here to feed me. She is here to see if I will still swallow her poison for the sake of keeping the peace. Through the distorted lens, she looks strangely small. The terrifying giant who once dictated the length of my skirts and the tone of my voice has shrunk into a desperate woman clutching a lukewarm tray of poultry. The power she held over me was never inherent. It was a projection, a shadow play she performed using the light of my own guilt. I realized that the fear I felt when that SUV pulled into the driveway was a ghost, a residual echo of a girl who no longer lives in this body. I feel a warmth on my shoulder that has nothing to do with the thermostat. Caleb has stepped into the hallway behind me. He doesn't say a word, and he doesn't reach for the handle. His presence is a solid anchor in the storm. He knows the cost of this silence. He was the one who sat in those windowless therapy offices with me in Missoula, holding my hand, while I sobbed through the realization that my mother's love was actually a form of incarceration. We have spent over $5,000 on professional counseling to deconstruct the internal architecture of duty that Diane spent 28 years building. We spent months unlearning the reflex to apologize for things I didn't do. We worked to erase the voice in my head that told me I was responsible for my parents' happiness. That money bought me the strength to stand here today and feel absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical curiosity. Caleb's hand squeezes my shoulder gently. He is watching the monitor, his eyes tracking the man in the suit who just approached our porch. I see his brow furrow. He isn't worried about the confrontation. He is confused by the presence of a process server on our property at the exact same time as my parents. The silence in the house is heavy, yet it feels clean. For the first time in my life, the air is not thick with the expectation of my mother's approval. I am an adult woman in my own home, protected by a husband who respects my boundaries and a legal system that, for all its flaws, recognizes my right to be left alone. Diane continues her monologue to the deadbolt. She starts listing the people back home who miss me. She mentions the pastor, the librarian, and the neighbors who haven't seen me in years. She is building a wall of witnesses trying to shame me through the wood. She doesn't realize that every name she speaks is a person I have already grieved and let go. Those people only know the version of me she curated for them. They know the lost sheep from the Facebook posts. They don't know the woman who had to change her identity to escape a mother who forged her medical records. I look back at Gerald through the peephole. He is standing by the railing, staring out at our quiet street. He looks like a man who is waiting for a signal. His impatience is growing, his foot tapping a jagged rhythm against the deck. He doesn't care about the chicken divan or the emotional reunion. He is looking at his watch again, then at the man in the suit who is now standing at the base of the stairs. There is a transactional energy to his movements that contradicts Diane's weeping. Suddenly, the man in the suit speaks. His voice is loud and professional, cutting right through Diane's performance. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance, I have a delivery for you." Diane stops mid-sentence, her face freezing into a mask of confusion. She turns away from the door, the casserole dish tilting dangerously in her hands. The man extends a thick envelope toward my father. Gerald reaches for it with a jerky, nervous motion, but he hesitates. He looks at my door, then at the man, then at the neighbors, who are now stepping out onto their porches to see what the commotion is about. The drama on my doorstep is no longer about a daughter refusing to see her parents. It has shifted into something far more public and potentially devastating for them. Diane's phone, which she was using to film me, is now pointed at the process server. She is trying to pivot to turn this new intrusion into another chapter of her victimhood, but the man in the suit isn't interested in her narrative. He repeats their names, confirms their identity, and drops the envelope at Gerald's feet when he refuses to take it. I feel a new conflict rising in the pit of my stomach. I thought I was the one being hunted today, but as I watch my father's face turn from purple to a ghostly, sickly gray, I realize that I am not the only one with secrets. My parents didn't just come here to bring me home. They came here because they are being pursued by something they can't manipulate with a social media post. The man in the suit represents a world of consequences that Diane cannot gaslight. As they stand there staring at the fallen envelope, I see a movement in the corner of the camera feed. A second vehicle, a dark SUV with local government plates, pulls up behind the black sedan. This isn't the police. It's the county assessor's office. I realize with a jolt of adrenaline that my parents' presence on my porch isn't just an emotional ambush. It is a desperate play for time. They aren't looking for a daughter. They are looking for a signature, and they are looking for it before the men in the suits take everything they have left. The peace I felt just moments ago is replaced by a sharp, urgent need to know exactly what kind of fire my parents have started back at the ranch, and why they think I am the only one who can put it out. The confrontation is about to explode, and the door between us is the only thing keeping me from being pulled into their burning house. The minute hand on the kitchen clock clicks forward, marking the 4th minute of this siege, and the thin veneer of parental concern begins to disintegrate. I can see the shift through the tiny glass eye in my door. The soft, melodic pleading Diane was using just moments ago vanishes, replaced by a jagged, frantic energy. She isn't getting the immediate submission she expected, and for a woman who has spent decades treating her daughter as a subordinate, silence is an intolerable form of defiance. Beside her, Gerald has stopped pretending to be the stoic observer. His patience has a short fuse, and it has finally burned down to the powder. He begins to pace the narrow length of the porch, his heavy work boots creating a hollow, rhythmic thumping against the timber that sounds like a drumbeat to a war I never signed up for. He turns toward the door, his face mottled with a dark, surging heat. "We know you are in there, Evelyn. Stop this nonsense right now. You are 30 years old and acting like a petulant child hiding under a bed. Open this door before we lose our temper." His voice is a roar calculated to bounce off the neighboring houses. This is not a father calling to his child. It is a landlord demanding entry to a property he thinks he still owns. I look past his shoulder and see the curtains of the house across the street flutter. Mrs. Gable, a retired librarian with a penchant for neighborhood gossip, is peering through her blinds with wide, inquisitive eyes. This is exactly what Diane wants. She knows that in a small Montana town, reputation is the only currency that matters. She is betting that my fear of being the subject of the neighborhood whisper network will outweigh my desire for autonomy. She sees the audience forming and launches into the next phase of her strategy, the public shame gambit. She collapses against the railing, the Pyrex dish clattering onto the porch table as she buries her face in her hands. The sobbing starts instantly, loud gasping performative wails that would win a trophy at any community theater. "Oh, Gerald, what have we done to deserve this?" She cries out, her voice pitching perfectly to ensure the sound carries to every open window on the block. "We gave her everything. We sacrificed our retirement to put her through school, and now she treats us like common criminals. My own daughter won't even look at me. In the past, this display would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have flung the door open, apologized for things I didn't do, and ushered them inside just to stop the neighbors from staring. I used to be terrified of the shadow she cast over my public life. I remember being 16 and having her stage a similar meltdown in the middle of a grocery store because I had picked out a brand of cereal she didn't approve of. I spent years trying to stay invisible so she wouldn't have a reason to make me the center of a spectacle. But as I watch her through the peephole today, the embarrassment doesn't come. Instead, I feel like a disinterested observer in a film I have already seen 100 times. I know every line of this script. I know that the tears are dry behind her palms, and that she is checking the reflection in the window to see if Mrs. Gable has come out onto her porch yet. Caleb shifts his weight behind me, his breath hitching as Gerald slams his fist against the siding of the house. The vibration rattles the framed photos in the hallway. Gerald is screaming now, his words becoming a blur of insults and demands. He calls me ungrateful. He calls me a coward. He yells that I have been brainwashed by the man standing behind me. It is a desperate, ugly display of a man losing his grip on a power dynamic that has already shifted. They are trying to bully the door open, failing to realize that the more they shout, the more they justify why that door stayed locked in the first place. Through the camera feed, I notice that the man in the suit hasn't left. He is standing at the edge of the lawn, calmly recording the entire outburst on his phone. He represents a reality that my parents are trying to shout down. Diane notices him too. She stops her crying mid-sob, her eyes narrowing as she realizes that her public performance is being documented by a professional witness. She tries to pivot, pointing a shaking finger at the man. "Who are you? Are you with her? Are you one of the people keeping my daughter from us?" She is trying to fold this new threat into her narrative of victimhood, but the man doesn't blink. He simply holds up the envelope that Gerald refused to touch. The tension on the porch is reaching a boiling point. My father is inches from the door, his chest heaving, his hand raised as if he is considering kicking the wood in. I can see the sweat on his brow despite the Montana chill. He looks at Diane, and for a split second, a look of pure, unadulterated panic passes between them. It isn't about me anymore. They are trapped between a daughter who won't speak and a legal representative who won't leave. The neighbors are now openly standing on their lawns, phones, out watching the respectable Vances lose their minds in front of a modest house in the highlands. Just as the drama seems to peak, a new sound cuts through the shouting. It is the distinctive chirping siren of a sheriff's deputy. A cruiser pulls up behind the SUV, its lights painting the front of my house in strobing flashes of red and blue. Diane lets out a triumphant shriek, thinking her call for a welfare check has finally been answered. She smoothed her hair, preparing to play the role of the rescued mother. But the deputy who steps out of the vehicle doesn't head for my front door. He walks straight toward the man in the suit. They exchange a brief nod, and the officer turns his attention to my parents. The look on my father's face is something I will never forget. The rage evaporates, leaving behind a hollow gray mask of terror. He realizes, perhaps for the first time, that he has invited the law into a situation where he is the one under scrutiny. Diane starts to speak, her voice trembling with a new, genuine fear. "Officer, you don't understand. We are just here to see our daughter." But the deputy isn't listening to her story. He holds up a hand, silencing her with a cold professional authority. He asks them for their identification, but he doesn't use the names on their driver's licenses. He asks for the owners of the Vance Ranch. I feel the floor shift beneath me. My parents didn't come here because they missed me. They didn't come here to apologize for the HR incident or the letters to Beatrice. They came here because the sheriff is looking for them, and they thought my house was the one place the law wouldn't think to check. The realization that they have used my sanctuary as a hideout sends a fresh wave of fury through me. They haven't just brought a casserole and a scene. They have brought a criminal investigation to my doorstep. I watch the deputy pull out a pair of handcuffs, and I realize the conflict is no longer about my silence. It is about the fact that my parents are running from something much bigger than a family feud, and they just led the entire Montana legal system right to my front gate. The curtains across the street are wide open now, and the drama is no longer a movie I've seen before. It's a live broadcast of a collapse I didn't see coming, and the next person the deputy looks at through the glass of the door is me. The digital clock on the microwave in the kitchen clicks over to the 11-minute mark. 11 minutes since the first thud of a fist against the wood. 11 minutes since the white SUV breached the sanctuary of my gravel driveway. In the grand timeline of a human life, 660 seconds is a blip, a fleeting moment of transition. But in the quiet hallway of my home in the highlands, those 11 minutes represent a tectonic shift in the landscape of my soul. As the deputy stands on the lawn and the man in the suit holds out his legal documents, a profound and heavy peace settles over me. It is a sensation so alien that I almost don't recognize it. It is the feeling of a vacuum being filled with solid, unshakable concrete. For 28 years, my mother's voice was the atmospheric pressure of my reality. It was the loudest sound in every room I occupied, even when she wasn't physically present. It was a voice that dictated the hemline of my skirts, the cadence of my speech, and the perceived value of my professional achievements. When I landed the senior analyst role in Missoula, her voice told me it was luck, not labor. When I met Caleb, her voice told me he was a predator disguised as a partner. She had installed a complex network of psychological wires within me, ensuring that every move I made toward independence triggered a surge of guilt that would pull me back to her center. I was a puppet who had mistaken the strings for my own nervous system. But as I stand here today watching her through the distorted lens of the peephole, the sound of her muffled yelling is just that. Noise. It is a frantic, vibrating frequency that stops dead at the 2-inch slab of solid oak separating our lives. The oak doesn't care about her tears. The deadbolt doesn't flinch at her accusations. I realize with a clarity that feels like ice water that her power was never an inherent force of nature. It wasn't a biological mandate. It was a gift I had been giving her every single day of my life. I had been the one providing the batteries for her control. By refusing to engage, by choosing the absolute stillness of this hallway over the chaos of her porch, I have reclaimed the power source. The silence is my declaration of independence. I watch her through the glass as the realization of her failure finally penetrates her performance. She stops crying. The transition is instantaneous and chilling, a shedding of a theatrical skin. She wipes the moisture from her cheeks with a brutal, efficient swipe of her hand. The grieving mother is gone, replaced by the woman I saw behind the closed doors of our ranch house for 2 decades. This is the Diane who threw a porcelain plate at the wall because I got a B+ in chemistry. This is the Diane who systematically deleted my college application emails because she decided I was too fragile to live in a dormitory. Her face is a mask of pure, cold fury, her eyes narrowed into predatory slits as she stares at the wood of my door. She knows I am watching. She can feel the weight of my gaze through the peephole, and she hates me for the vantage point I have claimed. She reaches down and picks up the Pyrex dish from the porch table. She doesn't place it gently on the welcome mat as a parting gift. She drops it, The jarring clack of glass hitting the heavy fiber of the mat echoes through the entryway like a gunshot. The checkered towel slips, revealing the congealed, yellowed surface of the chicken divan. It is a pathetic, ugly thing, a relic of a past I have outgrown. She stands over it for a second, her chest heaving with a rage she can no longer vent through a scream because the deputy is now watching her every move. She looks like a queen who has arrived to find her subjects have moved the throne and burned the palace. Beside her, Gerald has stopped his pacing. He is looking at the ground, his shoulders slumped in a way that suggests the weight of the legal envelope is starting to crush his spine. He doesn't look at the door anymore. He is looking at the police cruiser, his mind likely calculating the cost of the bridges he has spent the last year burning. I see him reach out and grab Diane's arm, his grip looking tighter than necessary. He mutters something to her, a low growl that makes her flinch. The dynamic on the porch is shifting from a unified front against their daughter to a fractured, desperate scramble for self-preservation. The man in the suit is still there, his pen hovering over a clipboard documenting the abandonment of the casserole and the visible aggression of my father. The peace I feel is the payoff of my silence. It is the dividend of 18 months of therapy and thousands of dollars spent on unlearning the duty she weaponized against me. I realize that I don't need her to understand why I left. I don't need her to apologize for the HR calls or the letters to Beatrice. I don't even need her to acknowledge my allergy to the mushrooms sitting on my mat. Her acknowledgement is a currency that has been hyperinflated until it is worthless. I have my own home, my own husband, and a career I am rebuilding on my own terms. The woman on the porch is just a stranger with a bad temper and a legal problem. Caleb leans his head against mine, his arm wrapping around my waist. He feels the stillness in me. He knows that the 11 minutes of watching them fail has done more to heal me than 100 hours of talking. I am not the daughter who abandoned her family. I am the woman who survived a siege. I am the one who stood behind the door and chose herself. But as I watch them prepare to leave, I notice Gerald stop at the top of the stairs. He turns back toward the door, and for a fleeting second, he looks directly into the peephole. He doesn't look angry anymore. He looks terrified. He mouths a single word, one that isn't part of the script of shame or anger they've been playing. He says, "Please." It isn't a plea for a reunion, it is a plea for protection. I see him glance at the second vehicle that just pulled up, the one with the government plates, and I realize that the 11 minutes of peace were just the eye of the storm. The real reason they are here is about to be unveiled, and it involves a secret that Gerald has been keeping even from Diane. A secret that is currently being unloaded from the trunk of the county assessor's car in the form of a foreclosure notice for the ranch. The conflict is no longer about my silence. It is about the fact that they have lost everything, and they think my signature is the only thing that can stop the bank from taking the roof over their heads. The serenity of my hallway is about to be tested by a new, much more desperate kind of warfare. The physical threat to my front door finally dissipates as the reality of the sheriff's presence settles over the porch like a heavy frost. Gerald reaches out with a rough jerking motion and seizes Diane by the upper arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of her floral sleeve. The performance of the grieving mother is over, replaced by the panicked urgency of two people whose exit strategy is rapidly evaporating. I hear his voice, no longer a roar but a low, jagged rasp that carries through the wood. He mutters about wasted gas, and the sheer audacity of an ungrateful brat who would let her own flesh and blood stand in the cold while the law circles. There is no warmth in his tone, only the transactional bitterness of a man who viewed this trip as a business investment that just went belly up. I watch through the digital feed as they retreat down the stairs. Their gait is heavy, lacking the confident stride they arrived with. They walk past the Pyrex dish, which sits abandoned like a discarded prop from a failed play. As they head toward their white SUV, a surge of specific sharp resentment pricks at my skin. That vehicle is a late-model luxury edition polished to a mirror shine that reflects the Montana sky. It was purchased 3 years ago with the college fund they had supposedly set aside for me since birth. I remember the night they sat me down at the scarred oak table of the ranch house, explaining with practiced sighs that the market had dipped and my education was a luxury the family couldn't afford. They told me I needed to be a team player to take out predatory student loans while they protected the family assets. 6 months later, that SUV appeared in the driveway. Seeing them climb into it now, using the very wheels bought with my stolen future to flee the consequences of their current greed, feels like a poetic closing of a circle I never wanted to be part of. The engine rumbles to life, a low-frequency vibration that I feel in the soles of my feet. Gerald doesn't look back at the house. He reverses with a reckless jerk, the tires spitting gravel against the underside of the chassis with a sound like sporadic gunfire. They pull out onto the main road, the white paint of the car disappearing behind the row of pines that marks the edge of my property. The sheriff's deputy stays for a moment, speaking to the man in the leather jacket, before he too returns to his cruiser. Within seconds, the street returns to its suburban stillness. The neighbors retreat back into their homes, their curiosity satisfied, for now leaving behind only the cooling casserole on my mat as evidence of the intrusion. The silence that follows is not the hollow, ringing quiet of a vacuum. It is a dense, heavy stillness that feels earned. I step away from the door, my muscles finally unclenching from the defensive posture they have held for nearly 15 minutes. The hallway feels wider, the ceiling higher. I am no longer a target behind a barricade. I am simply a woman in her home. But as I turn to head toward the kitchen, the phone in my hand gives a sharp, demanding buzz. It is a notification from a number I don't recognize, but the cadence of the words is as familiar as my own heartbeat. The text is short-stripped of the flowery pretension Diane used on the porch. It says, "You will regret this when we are dead." It is the ultimate weapon in the arsenal of the narcissistic parent, the expiration date threat. It is designed to trigger a lifetime of conditioned guilt to make me feel the weight of a funeral that hasn't happened yet. In the past, a message like that would have kept me awake for a week, imagining their lonely demise and blaming myself for every gray hair on their heads. Today I look at the blue bubbles on the screen and feel nothing but a weary sense of closure. I don't delete the message. I want it to remain in the digital archives as a testament to her final play. I simply tap the contact scroll to the bottom and hit the block button. The screen flickers for a microsecond and then the connection is severed. Diane Vance no longer has a digital bridge into my life. I walk into the kitchen, the sunlight streaming across the granite countertops in long golden slats. Caleb is already there, leaning against the island, his eyes searching mine. He doesn't ask if I am okay. He knows that okay is a complicated word for a day like this. Instead, he reaches for the coffee beans. The sound of the grinder fills the room, a mundane domestic noise that anchors me to the present. I watch the steam begin to rise from the pot, the rich, earthy scent of the roast masking the lingering metallic tang of adrenaline in the air. This is the ritual of my new life. This is the peace that comes after the storm has been denied entry. The house is quiet, but it is a full silence. It is filled with the sound of the refrigerator humming, the wind whistling through the eaves, and the steady breathing of a man who loves me without conditions. I realized that for my entire life, I thought peace was something that would be granted to me once I finally became the person my mother wanted. I thought if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and yielded enough, the screaming would stop. I was wrong. Peace wasn't a gift from the victor. It was a boundary drawn by the survivor. As I pour myself a mug, the heat radiating through the ceramic into my palms, I catch sight of a small white envelope that had been tucked under a magnet on the fridge. It is a property tax assessment for a small parcel of land my grandfather left me, a piece of the family ranch that Diane and Gerald have tried to pretend doesn't exist for a decade. Looking at that paper now, combined with the image of the process server on my porch and the panic in my father's eyes, a new realization begins to take shape. My parents didn't just show up because they were running from a lawsuit. They showed up because they need something from me that is far more valuable than a reconciliation. I take a sip of the coffee, the bitterness grounding me. The departure of the SUV wasn't the end of the story. It was just the moment the hunters realized they were the ones being hunted. If they are facing foreclosure, and if they are desperate enough to bring a casserole to a woman they tried to destroy 18 months ago, it means the land I own is the only thing left standing between them and total ruin. The conflict hasn't vanished. It has merely moved from my front porch to the county records office. I feel a strange cold surge of anticipation. They spent my childhood taking things from me: my confidence, my career, my college fund. Now for the first time, I am the one holding the deed. The silence in the kitchen is broken by the sharp ring of my lawyer's office line. I pick up the phone, and as I listen to Sarah's voice on the other end, I realize that the surprising payoff I've been waiting for is no longer a dream of escape. It is a reality of leverage. My parents are about to find out that the daughter they abandoned is the only person on earth who can save them, and I have absolutely no intention of opening that door either. The morning light in Montana has a way of being brutally honest, illuminating every speck of dust and every crack in the floorboards that you usually choose to ignore. 3 days had passed since the white SUV left its tire marks in my gravel, and the silence in my home had finally begun to feel permanent. I was sitting at the breakfast nook watching a hawk circle the distant pines when the mail carrier's truck rattled up to the box. Usually the mail is a mundane collection of utility bills and grocery store flyers, but today there was a single thick envelope made of heavy cream-colored cardstock. The return address was for a high-end title company based out of Billings. My stomach performed a slow, sickening roll. My first instinct was that Diane had followed through on her text message. I assumed this was a lawsuit, a final desperate attempt to litigate me back into her orbit, or perhaps a defamation claim for the scene on the porch. I took the envelope to the kitchen island, my fingers trembling slightly as I slid a butter knife under the seal. I expected to see a summons or a list of demands from a family attorney. Instead, what I pulled out was a thick stack of property deeds, land survey maps, and a notarized letter from a trustee. As I began to read the dense legal jargon, the air seemed to vanish from the room. The document outlined the ownership structure of the Vance Ranch, the 400 acres of prime grazing land that my parents had always treated as their private kingdom. According to the title company, my parents didn't actually own the entire property. My grandfather Silas, a man of few words and a suspicious mind when it came to his own son's financial habits, had left a silent contingency in his will before he passed away a decade ago. He had placed 40% of the ranch, specifically the lush north pasture and the water rights to the creek, into a protected trust. The beneficiary of that trust was me. The document stated that the ownership would remain under the management of the estate until my 30th birthday, at which point the title would automatically transfer into my name. I had turned 30 exactly 1 week ago, the day before my parents appeared on my porch with that congealed chicken casserole. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sudden appearance of Diane and Gerald wasn't sparked by a sudden onset of parental guilt or a desire for a family reunion before they grew too old. They hadn't driven 3 hours because they missed the sound of my voice. They had come because they were in a corner. A quick scan of the secondary documents revealed that my father had attempted to take out a massive bridge loan against the ranch 3 weeks prior. He had also been in secret negotiations with a commercial land developer who wanted to turn the north pasture into a luxury glamping retreat. Both the bank and the developer had run a title search and discovered the same thing I was looking at now. They couldn't move a single clod of dirt or secure a cent of credit without my notarized signature. The lost sheep narrative, the social media prayers, the performative sobbing on my porch, it was all a calculated business maneuver. I wasn't a daughter to them in that moment. I was a minority shareholder who had gone dark. They needed me to open that door so they could manipulate me into signing away my birthright before I even knew I had one. The casserole wasn't a peace offering, it was a bribe. They were trying to butter up a business partner they had spent the last 18 months trying to emotionally and professionally incinerate. I looked at the survey map, tracing the lines of the land where I had grown up. I remembered Silas taking me out to that north pasture when I was a little girl. He would sit on the tailgate of his rusted Ford and tell me that land was the only thing in this world that didn't lie to you. I realized now that he saw exactly what Diane and Gerald were. He knew that if he left everything to my father, the ranch would be liquidated for SUVs and vanity projects within 5 years. He had hidden my future inside a legal vault, waiting for me to reach an age where I might have the backbone to protect it. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. While Diane was busy calling my boss and telling him I was a drug addict, she was actively destroying the person she needed to save her from bankruptcy. While she was writing letters to Beatrice about my history of deception, she was ensuring that I would never want to do her a single favor. They had spent nearly 2 years nuking every bridge between us, never once imagining that the bridge they were burning was the only one that led to their financial survival. Caleb walked in, seeing the papers scattered across the island. He picked up the trustee's letter, his eyes widening as he reached the section about the 40% stake. He looked at me, then back at the papers. "Evie," he whispered, "this land is worth a fortune. If they can't sell that pasture, what happens to the rest of the ranch?" I looked at the foreclosure warning I had noticed earlier tucked behind the title report. If they don't get your signature, the bank seizes the whole thing. The house, the barns, the south acreage. Everything. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity. The conflict was no longer about whether I would forgive them for the HR incident or the public shaming. That era of our lives was over. We had moved into a purely transactional reality, one where I held the high ground and they were drowning in the valley. They had tried to make me small, to make me feel like I had nothing without them. But the truth was exactly the opposite. Without me, they were just two people in an expensive SUV with nowhere to park it. But as I sat there, a new and darker thought began to take hold. If they were this desperate, they wouldn't just stop at one porch visit. Now that the 30-day window for the developer's offer was closing, the tactics would shift from fake tears to something much more aggressive. My father was a man who didn't handle being told no, especially when it involved money he already felt he had spent. I looked toward the window, half expecting to see that white SUV idling at the end of the road again. The silence of my kitchen was suddenly interrupted by a sharp electronic chime. It wasn't my phone this time, it was the security system. Someone was at the perimeter gate, and they weren't knocking. I pulled up the camera feed on my tablet and saw a black sedan I didn't recognize. A man in a suit got out, but he didn't look like the process server from the other day. He looked like an attorney. He walked up to the call box and pressed the button. "This is the legal counsel for Vance Holdings," he said, his voice echoing through the speaker. "I am here to discuss a mandatory partition suit regarding the property in Mager County." My heart hammered against my ribs. They weren't coming for me with casseroles anymore. They were coming for me with a lawsuit to force a sale of the land. They were trying to sue their own daughter to strip her of the only thing her grandfather had left her. The peace I had felt for the last 3 days evaporated, replaced by the grim realization that this wasn't a family feud anymore. It was a high-stakes legal war, and my parents were willing to use the court system to finish the job that their psychological warfare couldn't. I looked at Caleb, and I knew that our quiet life in the highlands was about to become a battlefield. The next conflict wasn't just suggesting itself. It was ringing my doorbell with a briefcase in its hand. The weight of the deed sitting on my kitchen island felt like lead. I didn't reach for the gate intercom to speak with the man in the charcoal suit. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed Sarah, the attorney who had helped me navigate the wreckage of the HR incident 18 months ago. Sarah is a sharp-eyed woman who grew up in the legal trenches of Billings, and she doesn't waste breath on pleasantries when a storm is brewing. I told her about the title company documents, the 30% stake my grandfather had hidden from my parents, and the aggressive representative currently idling at my perimeter fence. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that usually precedes a massive shift in gravity. "Evelyn, you need to listen to me very carefully," Sarah began, her voice dropping into a register of grim professionalism. "They aren't just looking for a signature to sell some grass. There is a massive development firm out of Denver that has been scouting that specific valley for 2 years. They have a standing offer of $2 million for the North Pasture alone because of the water access and the proximity to the national forest. Your parents already signed a preliminary intent to sell 6 months ago. They took an advance on that money, Evelyn. They've already spent a significant portion of it on that new SUV and paying down the interest on their revolving debt. But the developer's legal team finally caught the error in the title. They realized your father didn't actually have the authority to sell the most valuable portion of the ranch. Without you, the entire deal is dead, and the developer can sue your parents for breach of contract to claw back that advance. A cold, hollow realization washed over me, more chilling than the Montana winter. The puzzle pieces of the last year and a half suddenly snapped into a horrific, coherent picture. My mother's crusade wasn't just the result of a bruised ego or a desperate need for control. Every single action she had taken, the calls to my boss at the marketing firm, the fabricated reports of drug use, the letters to Caleb's mother describing my history of clinical deception, even the missing person posts on social media, it was all a preemptive legal strike. They weren't trying to bring me home because they loved me. They were trying to build a public record of my incompetence. Diane and Gerald were laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally unfit or legally incapacitated. If they could prove to a judge that I was unstable or under the influence of a cult or a habitual liar who had abandoned her family in a state of psychosis, they could have contested the validity of Silas's trust. They were trying to disqualify me from my inheritance before I even knew it existed. They wanted a court-appointed conservatorship so they could sign my name on those development contracts themselves. The social media campaign wasn't a cry for help, it was evidence gathering. They were harvesting the sympathetic comments of my former teachers and neighbors to use as character witnesses in a courtroom. I felt a surge of nausea as I looked back at the digital feed of the man at my gate. He wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to serve me with a partition suit, a legal maneuver used to force the sale of a property when owners can't agree. By making me look like a dangerous or erratic recluse who refused to even speak to her grieving parents, they were hoping to convince a magistrate that I was an obstructionist who was devaluing the estate. They were turning my self-preservation into a weapon to be used against me. The chicken casserole on my porch wasn't just a bribe. It was the final bit of theater they needed to show the world they had tried everything before being forced to take legal action against their cruel daughter. The betrayal felt different this time. It wasn't the stinging heat of a slap. It was the bone-deep ache of realizing I had been hunted by my own blood for profit. My parents had looked at me and seen nothing but a barrier to a $2 million payday. They were willing to destroy my career, my marriage, and my reputation just to clear a path to a developer's checkbook. Sarah continued talking, explaining the technicalities of the partition suit, but my mind was stuck on the image of my mother dabbing her eyes for the neighbors while she calculated the commission on my grandfather's land. I looked at Caleb, who was standing by the window, his hand resting on the glass. He had been the one to hold me when I thought I was losing my mind, when I thought my mother's attacks were a sign of her genuine, albeit warped, concern. Now we both knew the truth. We were living in a house built on my resilience, while they were trying to dismantle it for the timber. The leverage had shifted, but the stakes had become lethal to any hope of a quiet life. If I didn't act, the legal system they were trying to manipulate would become their newest tool for my incarceration. "Sarah, what are our options?" I asked, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. Sarah's tone sharpened. "They are over-leveraged, Evelyn. They are desperate. In the state of Montana, a partition suit is expensive and slow. They don't have the time or the liquidity to fight a prolonged battle if we hit back hard. But you have to understand that as soon as we file a response, the gloves are off. They will double down on the smear campaign to save their investment. You have the leverage because you own the water rights, but they have the narrative because they've been telling it for 18 months. I stared at the black sedan at the gate. The man inside was checking his watch, mirroring the same impatient gesture my father had used on the porch. They thought I was still the girl who could be bullied into a corner. They thought if they screamed loud enough and used enough legal jargon, I would crumble just to make the noise stop. But they had forgotten one thing. Silas hadn't just left me the land. He had left me his stubbornness. He had left me the ability to stand my ground when the wind started to howl. I have spent my life playing defense. Sarah, I said, watching the man at the gate finally pull away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. I've spent 18 months hiding. That ends today. If they want to treat this as a hostile takeover, then let's show them what happens when the majority shareholder fights back. I want you to pull every record of their debt. I want a full audit of the ranch's finances over the last decade. If they've been using trust funds to pay for that SUV or their credit cards, I want to know about it. As I hung up the phone, a new conflict began to pulse in the room. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about the fact that my parents had committed fraud to get that initial advance from the developer. By signing an intent to sell land they didn't fully own, they had stepped into a criminal gray area. They weren't just facing bankruptcy. They were potentially facing prison time for real estate fraud. The realization made my blood run cold. Desperate people do desperate things, and my father was now a man with a target on his back and nothing left to lose. I looked at the security monitors and realized that the black sedan was gone, but a new vehicle was parked just out of sight of the main gate. A beat-up truck I recognized from the ranch. My father wasn't waiting for the lawyers anymore. He was sitting in the shadows of the pines watching my house, and the look on his face through the telephoto lens wasn't one of a businessman. It was the look of a man who was ready to burn the whole valley down if he couldn't have his way. The legal war had just become a physical threat, and the silence of the Montana highlands was about to be broken by a desperation that no lawyer could settle. The cold wind of the Montana highlands whistled through the vents of my kitchen, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the legal documents scattered across my island. I stood there staring at the pixelated image of my father's rusted truck idling in the tree line. In the past, this kind of intimidation would have sent me dialing their number, sobbing and pleading for an explanation. I would have demanded to know how they could betray me for a developer's check, or why my own mother thought my sanity was a negotiable asset. But 18 months of silence had taught me a brutal, effective lesson. Any emotion I showed them was just more data for their algorithm of control. If I cried, I was unstable. If I yelled, I was aggressive. If I reached out, I was vulnerable. I turned away from the window and looked at the phone. I didn't call the ranch. I didn't send a scathing text to Diane about her two-faced social media prayers. I didn't even acknowledge the man in the truck. Instead, I picked up the receiver and called Sarah. My voice was a flat, clinical drone. I told her I had made a decision, but it wasn't the one my parents or the Denver developers were expecting. I wasn't going to fight a 5-year partition suit in a county court. I wasn't going to spend my life savings defending my grandfather's pasture while Diane told the local newspaper I was a recluse. I was going to use the only thing these people actually valued against them. I was going to turn their greed into my iron dome. Sarah, I want you to draft a settlement offer. I said, my eyes tracking the hawk as it finally dove for its prey in the distance. Tell them I will sign over every square inch of my 40% stake in the North Pasture. I will waive my rights to the water. I will give them the signature they need to finalize the $2 million deal with the developers. Sarah started to protest, mentioning the sheer volume of wealth I would be walking away from, but I cut her off. I am not selling that land for money, Sarah. I am selling it for a vacuum. The terms of my countermove were designed to be a surgical strike against their specific brand of malice. I instructed Sarah to draft a formal notarized settlement that included a global cease and desist agreement. This wasn't just a polite request to stop calling, it was a comprehensive legal gag order. If Diane or Gerald ever contacted me, Caleb, or any member of Caleb's family, again the agreement would be voided in a way that hurt them at their core. If they sent a single letter to Beatrice, made one phone call to my employer, or posted so much as a pixelated photo of me on social media, they would forfeit the entirety of their 60% share of the land sale. I wanted a clause that stated, if they breach the peace even once, their portion of the $2 million would be immediately diverted into a blind trust for a charity of my choosing. I suggested a local organization that helped victims of domestic emotional abuse and gaslighting. I wasn't just buying my freedom from their presence. I was putting a massive, undeniable price tag on their spite. I was telling them that they could have their luxury retirement and their expensive SUVs, but the moment they tried to touch my life again, they would become penniless. In the transactional logic of my father's world, this was the only language that carried weight. He didn't understand love, but he understood a penalty clause. Sarah whistled low on the other end of the line. Evelyn, you are essentially holding their retirement hostage. If they sign this, they are effectively agreeing to act as if you don't exist under the threat of total financial ruin. That is a bold play. I told her it was the only play. For 28 years, they had treated me as an asset they could liquidate whenever they felt a chill in their bank account. Now I was making myself the most expensive hobby they could ever pursue. I was making my silence a requirement for their survival. I spent the next hour reviewing the draft, ensuring there were no loopholes. I included my husband's professional network and my future children in the protection zone. I made sure the definition of contact included third-party messengers so Diane couldn't use Aunt Joyce or some high school friend as a proxy for her bile. This was my version of scorched earth. I was handing them the keys to the kingdom they wanted so badly, but the gates were rigged with explosives that only they could trigger. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, the truck at the end of my driveway finally rumbled to life and pulled away. My father didn't know yet that the daughter he was trying to intimidate had just shifted the entire board. He thought he was winning because he had more lawyers and a louder voice. He didn't realize that in a game of survival, the person who is willing to walk away from the money is the one who holds all the cards. I felt a strange cold lightness in my chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I was waiting for their greed to outrun their hatred. Caleb walked into the room as I hit the send button on the final document. He looked at the screen, then at me. "You are giving up a lot of money, Evie," he said, his voice soft but supportive. I looked at the dark wood of my front door, thinking of the 11 minutes I spent watching through the peephole. "I'm not giving up anything, Caleb. I'm paying a debt I've owed myself since I was 16. I'm buying the right to never have to look through a peephole again." But as the evening settled into a deep Montana purple, a new vibration disturbed the quiet. It wasn't a phone call or a text. It was a local news alert on the television in the living room. The reporter was standing in front of the Mayher County Courthouse, talking about a sudden investigation into a prominent local ranching family. My heart skipped a beat as the name Vance flashed across the screen. The conflict hadn't waited for my settlement offer to arrive. It appeared that my parents' desperation had led them to do something far more dangerous than just harassing me. They had allegedly falsified government grazing permits to inflate the value of the ranch for the Denver developers. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. If the ranch was under federal investigation for fraud, my 40% stake wasn't just leverage anymore. It was a liability. By offering to sign over my rights, I might have just tried to hand a ticking time bomb back to the people who built it. The legal war was no longer just about a cease and desist. It was about whether I would be dragged down into the criminal wreckage of their failing empire before the ink on my settlement could even dry. I looked at the phone, wondering if Sarah had already sent the offer, and for the first time I felt a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of my mother's voice. It was the fear that the bridge I was trying to burn was already engulfed in a fire that could consume us all. The drama wasn't just increasing. It was spiraling into a territory where no notarized agreement could protect me. I needed to know how deep the fraud went, and I needed to know it before the federal agents decided that I was a part of the family business after all. The news of my settlement offer and the brewing legal storm over the ranch hit the extended Vance family like a tactical grenade dropped into a quiet Sunday dinner. In the world of Montana, ranching families' secrets are usually buried deeper than the frost line. But when $2 million in a federal investigation are on the table, the ground starts to heave. I didn't have to wait for the official response from my parents' lawyers. The family network, that invisible web of cousins, second cousins, and meddling elders, ignited within hours of Sarah sending the draft. My phone, which had been a source of peace for several days, began to vibrate with such frequency that it skittered across the granite countertop. The first caller to breach the silence was Aunt Joyce. Joyce is my father's older sister, a woman who prides herself on being the self-appointed matriarch of the clan and the chief enforcer of our family's public image. She is the kind of woman who sends out holiday newsletters filled with fabrications about her children's success, while hiding the fact that her own husband hasn't worked in a decade. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the red button, but I realized that if I didn't face the enforcer, the rest of the mob would only grow louder. I took a steadying breath and answered. The scream that erupted from the speaker was so sharp it made my ear ring. "Evelyn, how could you do this?" Joyce shrieked, her voice trembling with a mixture of genuine panic and practiced indignation. "Your mother is in hysterics. Your father is talking about selling the cattle just to keep the lights on. You are bankrupting your own parents over some petty grudge from years ago. Have you no heart? Do you want to see them on the street? Do you want to be the reason the Vance name is dragged through the mud in the Meagher County ledger?" I stood in my kitchen looking out at the vast, uncaring beauty of the mountains and felt a strange, detached calm. The old Evelyn would have started stammering. She would have tried to explain her side to justify her pain to earn Joyce's understanding. But that girl had died on the porch 3 days ago. I waited for Joyce to run out of breath listening to her ragged inhalation before I spoke. My voice was low, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of the apology she was fishing for. "Joyce, let us talk about the math," I said, my tone as cool as the morning dew. "Because clearly Diane hasn't given you the full balance sheet. My offer signs over the north pasture, which clears their debt with the Denver developers and settles the bridge loan. After the taxes and the legal fees are paid, they are walking away with over $1.2 million in liquid cash. They still own the south acreage and the main house. They aren't being bankrupted, Joyce. They are being given a graceful exit from a disaster of their own making. What they are actually losing is the ability to use me as a financial shield. They aren't losing their home. They are losing their control." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "In our family, you weren't supposed to talk about the numbers. You were supposed to talk about loyalty, sacrifice, and the sanctity of the bloodline. By dragging the actual figures into the light, I had violated the primary rule of their manipulation." Joyce sputtered, her outrage shifting gears. "That is not the point. You are holding a knife to their throats with this cease and desist nonsense. You are treated your mother like a criminal. She just wanted to see you. She brought you dinner. She brought me a dish filled with an allergen that could have put me in the hospital, and she did it while filming for her Facebook audience." I countered, my voice sharpening just a fraction. "Joyce, the family loyalty you are preaching has always been a one-way street. When I needed help with college, the vault was locked. When I needed protection from Diane's smear campaign at my job, you all looked the other way. You weren't worried about the family name when she was calling me a drug addict to my boss. You only care about the name now because it is attached to a bank account that is currently under federal scrutiny." The mask didn't just slip in that moment, it fell off and shattered on the floor. Joyce's voice dropped the pretense of the concerned aunt. Her tone became venomous, a low hiss that revealed the true rot beneath the floral wallpaper of our family history. "You think you are so smart with your fancy city life and your architect husband? You're just a traitor. If those federal agents come sniffing around the ranch, we will tell them exactly who was in charge of the records when you were still living there. We will make sure you go down with the ship, Evelyn. You won't be sitting in your pretty house while we lose everything." The threat was naked and ugly. It confirmed everything I had suspected. The family wasn't circling the wagons to protect my parents. They were circling to protect themselves from the fraud investigation. They needed a scapegoat, and since I had already been cast as the wayward, unstable daughter, I was the perfect candidate to take the fall for the falsified grazing permits. My realization from earlier was correct. They didn't want me back because they loved me. They wanted me back so they could pin the criminal liability on the daughter who had supposedly gone rogue. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself, and I realized that trying to win a moral argument with these people was like trying to teach a wolf to eat grass. I simply said, "I'm glad we had this talk, Joyce. It makes the next part much easier." Then I hung up and immediately dialed Sarah. The fallout was spreading. I could see the missed calls from my cousins, the people I used to spend summers with, now likely mobilized by Joyce to pressure me into withdrawing the cease and desist. They were terrified that if my parents signed the agreement, they wouldn't be able to coordinate their stories for the federal investigators. I was cutting off their ability to collude, and in doing so, I was exposing the entire crooked structure of the ranch's business practices. Caleb walked into the room, his face etched with worry. He had heard the shouting from the other room. "They're turning on you, aren't they?" he asked. I nodded, feeling a cold fire in my chest. "They aren't just turning on me, Caleb. They're trying to build a cage. They think they can scare me into silence by threatening to implicate me in their fraud. But they forgot that I've kept every email, every ledger, and every handwritten note Diane ever sent me. I have the receipts from when I was 19, and they forced me to sign documents I didn't understand." I looked at the phone, which was ringing again. This time it was a number I recognized as the land developer's office. The pressure was mounting from every direction. The family wanted a scapegoat, the developers wanted their land, and the feds wanted the truth. I was the pivot point for a multi-million-dollar collapse. I realized that my formal offer wasn't just a way out anymore. It was a weapon that had initiated a chain reaction I couldn't stop. But as the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard, a new vehicle appeared at the end of the driveway. It wasn't my father's truck or a lawyer's sedan. It was a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates. Two men in windbreakers stepped out, and even from the distance of the porch camera, I could see the yellow letters on their backs. This wasn't the county assessor or a process server. The federal investigation had arrived at my doorstep, and as I watched them walk toward my house, I realized that my Aunt Joyce's threat was already being put into motion. My parents hadn't just rejected my offer, they had preemptively pointed the finger at me. The silence of the highlands was about to be replaced by the cold, sterile environment of an interrogation room, and I had to decide right now if I was going to protect the family name or burn it to the ground to save myself. The conflict had just leaped from a property dispute to a fight for my literal freedom, and the next knock on the door wouldn't be for a casserole. The sterile atmosphere of the law office in downtown Bozeman was a sharp contrast to the rugged, untamed beauty of the Gallatin Valley visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat on one side of a polished mahogany table that felt like a vast wooden desert, separating me from the two people who had given me life, and then spent years trying to lease it out for profit. The air in the room was conditioned to a perfect chilling 68 degrees, yet it felt heavy and stagnant, saturated with the scent of expensive stationery and the metallic tang of unspoken hostility. This was no longer a porch in the highlands or a childhood kitchen. This was a theater of war, where the currency was no longer affection or guilt, but cold, hard litigation. Across from me, Diane looked like a ghost of the woman who had pounded on my door days earlier. The meticulously coiffed floral aesthetic had crumbled. Her hair was unkempt, a frantic nest of graying strands that she kept tucking behind her ears with trembling fingers. The theatrical makeup she usually wore like a mask was absent, revealing the deep, jagged lines of exhaustion and fury that mapped her face. Beside her, Gerald was a shell of the man who had bellowed at my siding. He sat slumped in his leather chair, his gaze fixed firmly on a microscopic scratch on the table surface. He wouldn't look at me. He couldn't. To look at me was to acknowledge that the daughter he had treated as a line item on a ledger had finally closed the books. The meeting had been convened to finalize the settlement I had proposed through Sarah. My attorney sat to my right, her fingers hovering over a tablet, while my parents' lawyer, a man who looked like he had been carved out of a block of institutional gray granite, sat to their left. The silence was punctuated only by the low hum of the ventilation system and the occasional rhythmic tap of a pen against a legal pad. We were here to discuss the transition of 40% of the Vance Ranch and the implementation of the global cease and desist order that would effectively erase our relationship from the public record. The emotional layers of our conflict had been stripped away by the federal investigation mentioned by Aunt Joyce. The black SUVs at my gate had been a precursor to this moment. My parents were no longer fighting for their pride. They were fighting for their survival. The fraud investigation into the falsified grazing permits had reached a fever pitch, and they realized that without my signature on the development deal, they wouldn't have the funds to pay for the high-priced criminal defense attorneys they desperately needed. They were trapped in a vice of their own design, and I was the only one holding the handle. Diane leaned forward, suddenly her hands flat on the mahogany. The movement was jerky, lacking her usual calculated grace. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with a moisture that I no longer believed in. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice a thin, raspy thread that barely carried across the table. "How could you be so cold? How could you sit there and treat your own mother like a business adversary? We raised you. We gave you everything we had. After 18 months of silence, you come back only to put a price on our tongues. Is this what we taught you? Is this the person you wanted to become?" I felt the weight of her gaze, the same gaze that used to make me shrink into the upholstery of our family car. I remembered the nights I spent as a teenager agonizing over how to make her smile, how to be the perfect reflection she demanded. I remembered the ways she would use my secrets as leverage in front of the neighbors, turning my private vulnerabilities into public spectacles for her own amusement. She had spent 2 decades teaching me that relationships were built on utility, and that love was just a word used to soften the blow of a command. I leaned forward, matching her posture, my face a mask of absolute, unyielding stillness. I looked her dead in the eye, watching the flicker of recognition and then the bloom of fear in her pupils. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I learned from the best. "Mom," I said, the words falling like stones into a well. "You taught me that family is a tool. You taught me that people are only as valuable as what you can get out of them. You used me to bolster your reputation. You used my career to satisfy your ego, and you tried to use my sanity to clear your debts. I'm not being cold. I'm being efficient. I'm just using the tool better than you did." The gray granite lawyer cleared his throat, sensing the atmospheric pressure in the room reaching a breaking point. He pushed a set of documents toward the center of the table. "My client is prepared to sign the global cease and desist," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "They will agree to the financial penalties regarding any future contact. In exchange, we require the immediate notarized signature on the North Pasture transfer and the waiver of all claims regarding the previous management of the trust." Gerald's hand shook as he reached for the pen. He still wouldn't look at me, but I could see the muscles in his jaw working. He was a man who had built his identity on being the master of his domain, and now he was signing away the heart of his kingdom to the daughter he had tried to disqualify. He knew that as soon as the ink dried, the $2 million from the Denver developers would be wired, but he also knew that the money came with a leash. He was trading his voice for his freedom, and the irony was clearly choking him. I watched him sign, the scratching of the nib against the heavy paper, sounding like the ticking of a clock. Then it was Diane's turn. She lingered over the signature line, her eyes scanning the clause that mentioned the forfeiture of her 60% share should she ever post about me on social media again. It was the digital death of her martyr persona. She was signing away her right to play the victim to her Facebook followers. She was agreeing to become a ghost in exchange for a check. When she finally finished, she shoved the pen away as if it had burned her. The meeting was technically over, but the conflict was already suggesting its next evolution. As I stood up to leave, my attorney's phone chimed with an urgent notification. Sarah looked at the screen, her brow furrowing into a deep, worried V. She looked at my parents, then at their lawyer, and then at me. "Evelyn, we have a problem," she said, her voice dropping into a tense whisper. "The federal investigators didn't just stop at the grazing permits. They just executed a search warrant on the ranch's primary accounting firm in Missoula. They've discovered a second set of books that your father has been keeping since before Silas passed away." The room went icy. Gerald's head snapped up for the first time, his face draining of what little color it had left. Diane looked at him, her eyes wide with a realization that clearly hadn't reached her until this exact second. This wasn't just about grazing permits or a development deal anymore. The federal government had just uncovered a decade of systematic embezzlement from the very trust that had been holding my 40% stake. The money they had taken as an advance from the developers was just the tip of the iceberg. I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that by signing those papers, I had just officially tied myself to a transaction that was now the centerpiece of a federal racketeering case. The surprise payoff wasn't the freedom I had just bought. It was the fact that my parents had lured me into this office to sign documents that would make me appear as a co-conspirator in their decade-long theft. They didn't want my signature to sell the land. They wanted my signature to validate the fraudulent books before the feds could freeze the assets. The air in the conference room was no longer thick with silence. It was vibrating with the sound of a trap snapping shut, and the next person walking through that mahogany door wouldn't be a lawyer. It would be an agent with a badge, and the settlement I just signed might be the very thing that puts me in a cell right next to the people I spent my life trying to escape. The drama had just vaulted into a realm of criminal consequence that made the porch visit look like a playground dispute. The heavy, high-grade bond paper felt unnervingly smooth beneath my fingertips. In this air-conditioned vault of a conference room, the sounds of the outside world, the distant rumble of Bozeman traffic, and the call of mountain birds were entirely erased. All that remained was the rhythmic, predatory scratching of my father's fountain pen. Gerald didn't hesitate. He signed each page with a violent, jagged flourish, as if he were trying to stab the document into submission. He was a man who had spent his entire life treating the Montana soil as his personal bank account, and seeing him forced to trade his silence for a developer's check was a sight I had dreamed of for 18 months. He wasn't looking at the legalities or the ethics. He was looking at the exit ramp from the financial wreckage he had created. When the folder was slid toward me, I felt a strange, icy calmness take hold of my heart. This was the moment of the great exchange. I picked up the heavy silver pen provided by the firm. With each stroke of my name, I felt a literal physical weight lifting from my shoulders, as if an invisible harness that had been cinched tight since my childhood was finally being cut away. I was signing over 40% of my grandfather's north pasture. I was walking away from $1 million inheritance. To my parents, this was a sign of my weakness, a confirmation that I was the impulsive, irrational girl they had portrayed in their social media campaign. But to me, it was the purchase price of my soul. By signing these papers, I was erecting a legal iron dome over my life. Every stroke of ink was a brick in a wall that Diane and Gerald could never scale again without facing total financial annihilation. The final signature was blotted and dried. Sarah, my attorney, took the folder with a nod of professional satisfaction. The deal was done. The Denver developers would get their glamping retreat. My parents would get their bailout. And I would get the absolute guaranteed right to never hear their voices again. The tension in the room snapped like a dry branch. Gerald didn't wait for a handshake or a parting word. He snatched his copy of the agreement from the table with a grunt of triumph, his face still a mottled, angry gray. He marched toward the door, his heavy boots sounding like a drumbeat of retreat against the plush carpeting. He had what he came for, the signature that saved him from a bankruptcy court, or so he thought. He didn't even look back at the woman he had called a drug addict and a thief just weeks prior. I was no longer a daughter to him. I was a closed transaction. Diane, however, couldn't let the scene end without one final attempt at a theatrical encore. She lingered in her chair, her eyes scanning my face for a flicker of the old Evelyn, the one who would crack under the weight of a disappointed sigh. She stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of her unkempt floral blouse. She moved around the table, her hand hovering near mine, as if she intended to give it a final, manipulative squeeze, a gesture designed to imply that despite the lawyers and the lawsuits, she still held the emotional deed to my heart. I saw the movement coming from a mile away. It was the same reach she used when I was 10 and had tried to hide a bruised knee. She would touch the wound not to heal it, but to remind me who was in charge of the pain. I didn't let her touch me. I pulled my hand away with a sharp clinical precision and stood up, placing the mahogany table back between us. The silence was absolute. Diane's mouth twitched, her eyes brimming with a rehearsed moisture that had lost all its power over me. She looked like she wanted to say something about family, about the sanctity of blood, about how I would one day understand the burdens a mother carries. I didn't give her the chance to breathe life into the lie. "Enjoy the ranch while you still can, Diane," I said, my voice carrying a hollow metallic resonance that seemed to startle her. "I hope the developer's money is enough to keep you warm in that big empty house, because as of this moment, you are officially out of daughters. You traded your child for a north pasture, and I hope the grass is as green as you imagined." The mask of the grieving mother finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She realized then that the cease and desist wasn't just a legal threat, it was a total excommunication. She turned on her heel without a word, her heels clicking a sharp, angry staccato as she followed Gerald out of the office. I watched through the glass wall as they entered the elevator, two people who had spent their lives building a kingdom of shadows now stepping out into a sunlight that was about to become very, very hot. Sarah let out a long, slow breath behind me. "It is over, Evelyn." They signed. "The wire transfer is initiated. You are free." I looked at the empty chairs, the discarded pens, and the lingering scent of my mother's perfume, and I felt a surge of relief that was almost dizzying. But as I turned to gather my things, the door to the conference room didn't just stay closed. It swung open with a violence that made the glass rattle in its frame. The gray granite lawyer who had represented my parents didn't leave with them. He was standing there, his face no longer stoic but pale, holding a smartphone that was buzzing incessantly. "Mr. Vance just received a call from his foreman at the ranch," the lawyer stammered, his professional composure evaporating. "The federal agents didn't just find a second set of books. They found the physical storage unit where your father was hiding the original unaltered records from Silas's estate. And Evelyn, they didn't just find evidence of embezzlement. They found a series of forged signatures on the trust documents dating back 10 years. Signatures that were supposed to be yours but were clearly written by your mother." The air in the room became brittle. The conflict hadn't ended with the signing. It had just mutated into a criminal nightmare that the settlement couldn't cover. By signing that pasture over today, I had inadvertently validated a chain of title that was built on a decade of forgery. My parents didn't just want my signature to sell the land. They needed it to bury the evidence of their identity theft before the feds opened that storage unit. I looked at the folder on the table, the one I had just signed, and realized it wasn't a wall of protection. It was a confession. My mother's final attempt to touch my hand wasn't a manipulative squeeze. It was a desperate attempt to see if I had noticed the ink on the original trust was still the same brand she used at the kitchen table. The drama had just vaulted into a realm where my freedom was no longer a matter of civil law, but a race against a federal indictment. The next person coming for me wouldn't be looking for a signature. They would be looking for a mugshot, and the settlement I thought was my victory was now the primary evidence for my arrest. I had to move, and I had to move faster than the news could travel. The tires of my SUV hummed against the asphalt as I left the glass and steel of downtown Bozeman behind, heading toward the sanctuary of the high country. The jagged peaks of the Bridger Range watched over me like silent sentinels, their snow-capped summits glowing with a pale, ethereal light. For the first time in nearly a decade, the air inside the cabin felt breathable. The claustrophobic weight of the conference room with its mahogany tables and deceptive smiles was shrinking in the rearview mirror. I had survived the signing. I had navigated the legal minefield of the trust fraud by handing over every scrap of evidence I had meticulously archived during my 18 months of silence. Sarah had assured me that my cooperation with the federal investigators, combined with the fact that I was the primary victim of my mother's identity theft, had turned my settlement into a shield rather than a trap. The agents weren't looking for me anymore. They were looking for the original ink on the documents Diane thought she had buried. As the road twisted upward through the canyons, I felt the phantom strings that had tethered me to the ranch snapping one by one. The landscape opened up, revealing the vast amber waves of the Montana prairie under a sky that seemed to stretch into infinity. This was the big sky country I had always loved, but for years it had felt like a cage because my parents owned the horizon. Now the horizon belonged to no one but the wind. I wasn't the daughter who abandoned her family. I wasn't the unstable girl from the social media posts. I was an independent woman with a clear title to her own life. I pulled into my gravel driveway just as the evening shadows began to stretch across the timber of my porch. The white SUV was gone. The abandoned casserole dish was gone, likely taken by a hungry coyote or cleared away by the wind. In their place stood Caleb. He was leaning against the railing, his silhouette framed by the golden hour light. He didn't have a legal brief or a hidden camera. He had 2 brown paper bags filled with the scent of lemongrass and ginger. He had remembered the one thing my mother chose to forget for 20 years. He had ordered the Thai curry with absolutely no mushrooms. We didn't go inside. The house was a fortress, but the porch was where the victory had been won. We sat on the same weathered boards where Diane had staged her theatrical meltdown, our legs dangling over the edge as we unpacked the plastic containers. The steam from the spicy noodles rose into the crisp mountain air, a fragrant reminder of a reality that was simple, honest, and kind. We ate in a comfortable silence that didn't need to be filled with justifications or defenses. For the first time in my 30 years, a meal wasn't a performance of gratitude. It was just dinner. Caleb reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing the line of my knuckles. He didn't ask about the lawyers or the federal agents. He knew the paperwork was done. He looked out at the valley where the first few lights of the neighboring ranches were starting to twinkle like fallen stars. "You know," he said softly, his voice a warm anchor in the cooling breeze. "We have plenty of room in the second bedroom. We could finally start that office you wanted. Or a nursery. Whatever we want, Evie. It is our house. No one else has a key." The word nursery sent a soft, unfamiliar ripple through me. For years, I had been terrified of the idea of motherhood. I was scared that the poison Diane had pumped into my veins was hereditary, that I would eventually become a woman who used her children as chess pieces in a game of ego. But sitting here watching the way Caleb looked at me, not as an asset to be managed, but as a person to be known, I realized that the cycle ended with me. I could build a family where love wasn't a debt you could never pay off. I could raise a child who didn't have to look through a peephole to feel safe. We could create a legacy that wasn't built on forged signatures and stolen pastures. The Montana sunset began its final act, turning the sky a deep bruised purple that bled into a vibrant orange at the edge of the world. It was beautiful and vast, a celestial painting that didn't ask for anything in return. I leaned my head against Caleb's shoulder, closing my eyes, and listening to the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart. I was 30 years old, and for the first time in my conscious memory, I was not a character in someone else's drama. I wasn't the victim, the villain, or the lost sheep. I was the author of the next chapter. But as the darkness began to settle over the highlands, a new sound echoed from the valley below. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was the low, mournful howl of a siren, followed by the distant staccato flash of red and blue lights moving toward the highway that led to the Vance Ranch. The peace of our porch was undisturbed, but the horizon was being redefined. I knew what those lights meant. The federal agents had finished their inventory of the storage unit. The grace period for my parents' exit was over. I felt a final sharp pricking of emotion, not grief, but a profound sense of gravity. My parents were about to experience the absolute silence they had tried to impose on me. They were about to enter a world where their narratives and their floral blouses held no currency. The conflict had moved beyond my reach, passing into the hands of a justice system that didn't care about chicken divan or Facebook prayers. I squeezed Caleb's hand, acknowledging the flickering lights in the distance, and then I stood up. "Let's go inside," I whispered. "It is getting cold." As I turned toward the door, my phone gave a soft, singular chime in my pocket. It wasn't a text from a blocked number or a call from a lawyer. It was a notification from the developer's escrow account. The wire transfer for the North Pasture had been halted. The funds were being held in a federal stay pending the outcome of the fraud case. My parents' bailout had vanished into the mountain air, and the ranch they had fought so hard to keep was being seized as an instrument of crime. I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that while I had won my freedom, the land itself was now a ghost. The final payoff was far more complicated than a simple check. I was free, but the ground I had grown up on was now a crime scene, and the neighbors I had worried about were about to see a spectacle that would make my 11 minutes of silence look like a footnote. The drama wasn't just over, it was being buried under the weight of a federal seal, and the only thing left for me to do was to decide if I would ever look back at the smoke rising from the valley. The mountain air in Montana had turned sharp and crystalline by the time the final echoes of the Vance family collapse settled into the valley soil. 1 month had passed since the federal sirens faded into the distance. The ranch had been dismantled with the cold efficiency of a foreclosure auction. The cattle were gone, the North Pasture was locked behind a developer's temporary chain-link fence, and the name Vance had transitioned from a local dynasty to a cautionary tale whispered over coffee at the diner in town. I had spent those 30 days in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the phone to ring with one last threat, or a final desperate plea for a daughter to fix the unfixable. But the silence I had bought with my signature held firm. It was a heavy, indestructible barrier that even Diane's practiced wails couldn't penetrate. I was standing in my kitchen watching a light dusting of snow settle on the wood of the porch when the mail arrived. It was a single legal-sized envelope, remarkably light compared to the mountains of litigation I had been carrying for 18 months. I opened it with a steady hand no longer bracing for a blow. Inside was a cashier's check for the full amount of my legal fees, a reimbursement negotiated by Sarah as part of the developer's closing costs. They had paid for the very lawyer I used to defeat my parents. It was a clean numerical victory that felt like the final period at the end of a very long, very exhausting sentence. But as I pulled the check out, a small folded clipping from a newspaper fell onto the counter. It was a section from a regional business journal, a small blurb about the relocation of former Montana residents. My heart didn't race. My stomach didn't churn. I simply unfolded the paper and looked at the photo. There were Diane and Gerald standing in front of a stucco-walled luxury retirement villa in a gated community somewhere in the humid flatlands of Florida. The white SUV was parked in the driveway behind them, looking strangely out of place against a backdrop of palm trees and manicured sand. The transformation was jarring. Gerald looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His face was a map of defeated rage. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the sea-level air was too much for a man born in the highlands to bear. He wasn't the master of the ranch anymore. He was just another retiree in a polo shirt, living on a fixed income derived from the scraps of a settlement that barely covered his legal defense. Beside him, Diane was smiling for the camera, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a frantic, brittle expression, the face of a woman who had realized that her audience of neighbors and Facebook followers had vanished the moment the scandal broke. She had no one left to perform for, except the shadows of the villa. My gaze drifted to the background of the photograph peering through the glass of their new front window. There, clearly visible on the wall of their foyer, was a framed picture of me from high school. It was the same photo Diane had used for her social media siege, the one where I was smiling because I still believed that family was a safety net instead of a snare. For a split second, a flicker of the old guilt tried to rise in my chest, suggesting that they kept it because they missed me. But I looked closer at the way they were positioned in relation to that image. They didn't keep that photo out of love or nostalgia. They kept it as a trophy. It was a reminder of the war they had lost, a visual monument to the daughter who had finally outmaneuvered them. It was their version of a scar, a constant painful reminder that the land was gone, the legacy was dead, and I was the one who had walked away with my dignity intact. They were living in a paradise of their own choosing, but they looked utterly miserable. They were trapped together in 1,000 square feet of air-conditioned exile, two predators with nothing left to hunt but each other. The money was enough to keep them warm, as I had predicted, but it wasn't enough to buy back the respect or the power they had traded for a north pasture. They had spent my entire life trying to make me a character in their drama, and now they were forced to live in a house where my ghost was the only thing worth looking at. I walked over to the fireplace, the stones still warm from the morning's embers. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I felt a profound, shimmering sense of completion. I looked at the check for my legal fees, the physical proof that I had held my ground and won. Then I looked at the photo of the miserable couple in Florida one last time. I watched Diane's frozen, desperate smile and Gerald's hollow eyes, and I realized that the greatest punishment I could ever inflict on them was exactly what I had already done. I had become a stranger. I had removed my voice from their narrative, leaving them with nothing but a silent image on a wall. I tossed the newspaper clipping into the fireplace. I watched as the edges curled and blackened, the flame licking at the stucco villa and the white SUV. Within seconds, the image of my parents vanished into a swirl of orange and blue. I watched until the paper turned to a delicate gray ash that crumbled under the weight of the rising heat. Total peace settled over the room, as thick and comforting as a Montana blizzard. The digital camera on the porch remained dark. The phone on the counter remained silent. The mailbox at the end of the gravel was empty. Caleb walked into the room, his boots clicking softly on the hardwood. He saw the dying embers in the grate, and then he saw the check on the counter. He didn't ask what I had burned. He simply walked over and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood there for a long time, watching the snow fall outside the window. The world was vast, beautiful, and entirely ours. There were no more letters to Beatrice, no more calls to HR, and no more casseroles filled with lies. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of pine and wood smoke. For 30 years, I had been running from a storm that I thought was my own fault. I had spent my youth trying to navigate a maze where the walls were always moving. But as the last of the ash vanished up the chimney, I realized that the maze was gone. I had walked out of the labyrinth and into the sunlight of a life I had built with my own 2 hands. I was 30 years old, and I was finally irrevocably free. Total silence, total victory, total peace. The story of Evelyn and the Vance Ranch had reached its final, unchangeable conclusion. I turned toward my husband, toward my home, and toward a future that didn't have a single mushroom in the sauce, or a single string attached to the love. We walked toward the kitchen to start our evening, leaving the ghosts of the past to smolder in the hearth. The screen didn't fade to black. It opened up to a world that was finally big enough for me to stand tall in. I was no longer looking through a peephole. I was looking at the horizon, and for the first time I could see forever. The snow continues to fall outside my window, a white shroud covering the high Montana plains. It feels like a final benediction burying the tire tracks of the past and the echoes of the woman I used to be. Standing here in the quiet of my kitchen, I realize that the silence I once feared has become my most trusted ally. It isn't the silence of being ignored. It is the silence of being free. My parents are 3,000 miles away, trapped in a tropical retirement of their own making, staring at a photograph of a daughter they never actually knew. They have their villa and I have my soul. The transaction is complete. Looking back at the wreckage of the last 18 months, I see more than just a family feud or a legal battle. I see the architecture of a slow-motion survival. I learned that you cannot negotiate with people who view your boundaries as an act of war. I learned that blood might be thicker than water, but it can also be more toxic than lead if the vessel is broken. As I watch the last embers of that newspaper clipping fade into gray ash, I carry 5 fundamental truths with me into this new, unburdened life. First, I learned that silence is a sovereign territory. You are under no obligation to provide an audience for your own destruction. When I stopped answering the door and the phone, I didn't just stop the noise, I reclaimed the power they used to fuel their drama. Second, I realized that toxic loyalty is a debt that can never be paid. My parents spent my childhood convinced I owed them my future because they provided my past. But love isn't a ledger, and honor thy father and mother doesn't mean participate in your own demise. Shit. Third, the most dangerous weapon a manipulator has is the public narrative. Diane didn't need to be right. She just needed the neighbors to think she was a victim. I learned that the only way to win a game of public shaming is to stop caring about the opinions of people who only see the floral blouse and not the forged signature. Fourth, I discovered that leverage is better than closure. I spent years waiting for an apology that was never coming. I finally found peace when I stopped seeking a sorry and started seeking a legal cease and desist. Sometimes the only way to get a predator to leave you alone is to make yourself too expensive to hunt. Finally, I learned that the cycle ends exactly where you stand. I am 30 years old, and for the first time I am not a character in a script written by a woman who chose a ranch over her daughter's sanity. I am the author now. I can build a home where a child never has to wonder if their mother's love comes with a hidden price tag. The victory isn't in the money or the land. The victory is in the 11 minutes I spent watching through that peephole and feeling absolutely nothing. I am Evelyn, and I am finally, irrevocably mine. If this story reminded you that your peace is worth more than any inheritance, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your courage might be the signal someone else needs to hear. For more stories of resilience and the cold truths of the human heart, stay tuned to Hazel Tells Stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe that standing your ground is the only way to find your way home. Until next time, keep your boundaries high and your spirit higher.